Ms. Buller, thank you so much for joining us here today on APTN InFocus. We're a few years removed now from the final report and the 231 calls for justice. First off, my first question for you is have you seen any change over the last few years here?
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me today to talk about this important topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. Have I seen progress? Well, in some respects, yes. In the north, Yukon Territory, NWT, they have developed their own responses to our report and are actually making change. Elsewhere across Canada, perhaps not as organized or as easily accessed, but there is change. The federal government now has at least advertised for the position of Deputy Commissioner for Corrections regarding Indigenous people. I'm not too sure exactly what the job title is, but I know they're looking to hire somebody. And also, I think it's starting this week, there'll be a ministerial secretary assisting in establishing our call for justice that involves Indigenous and Human Rights Tribunal as well as an Indigenous ombudsperson. So there is change. However, Indigenous women and girls and 2S people are still going missing and are still being murdered.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is the situation, the recent situation here in Winnipeg where 4 Indigenous women were killed, and there's the possibility of a search of a landfill for 2 Indigenous women who are suspected to be there. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and maybe what you make of the whole situation.
Well, thank you. I think it's a very sad situation in Winnipeg, and my heart goes out to the family and friends of all of the women who have been murdered and whose remains are yet to be found. I think there's an important lesson to be learned from not too far down the road from me, the Picton farm here in British Columbia. At one point, the police brought in forensic archaeologists who actually were able to do an amazing job of finding human remains in very trying circumstances in terms of physical surroundings. The actual site itself was a very difficult site to work. And so I think that there are lessons to be learned about how to manage this type of search, who should do it, how long it might take, the resources needed, just by, first of all, looking at the Picton farm and how that was excavated. And also, I know technology has changed since that excavation was done. I guess it would be 8 or 9 years ago now, or even more, so that there'll be improvements in technology as well for excavating. And it has to be done. Those women's remains simply have to be found. They can't be considered garbage.
And you mentioned of what could be learned. That's sort of my next question, is what could be learned from previous situations, as well as the situation here in Winnipeg, both what to do in the situation, but maybe also how to handle the situation as well.
Yes, it's not only going and excavating the site, it's also how do you do it properly in ceremony, in supporting the families and in supporting the people who are doing the work too. It's very, very difficult work. And so I think a lot can be learned about what was done at the Picton farm and what wasn't done. And the work has to be done in the right way for everybody's sake.
And Ms. Buller, why are things like walks and rallies and movements that show support so important? I know that's something that happens pretty regularly, and it's really important they happen, but why is it that they're so important that they continue to happen?
You know, the rallies, the walks, the demonstrations, the workshops are all critically important to keeping this issue in the public eye and reminding politicians that there has to be change, that they have to be working diligently on our calls for justice. So they're important. They keep things in the public eye, and they get interest like APTN's interest. So it keeps everything in public view and on the agenda, so to speak.
And how specifically do they keep the issue on the agenda of what they're trying to go for and aim for, excuse me?
Well, vigils, walks, demonstrations, workshops, they're all very visible. And they're all very in the moment, in time. Social media picks them up immediately, well, even before they even start. And so they're reminding us, all of us, about the importance of the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, and how the genocide has to stop. And the commissioners and myself set out many different options for stopping that genocide. We just simply have to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Ms. Buller, what needs to be done moving forward? I mean, in your experience and expertise, you've done quite a number of things in your experience. What needs to be done here as we move forward?
Well, what we have to do moving forward is really work very diligently on systemic change, changing the systems, decolonizing systems. And by that I mean decolonizing the child welfare system. It's certainly a good start with First Nations across Canada being able to reclaim their children, our children, and have jurisdiction over their own children, which I just find is a bit of an oxymoron. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But not only to take back their own children, but to have the resources to do it properly and in a good way for the children and their families and for the community. And by decolonizing systems, I also mean decolonizing the justice system, not just the criminal justice system, but family. As well, family courts. Let's decolonize those. Let's get the power back in the hands of Indigenous people as opposed to the colonial governments. Let's make sure that Indigenous governments are properly resourced so that they can take back, rather than just trading off and saying, well, here you go, First Nation, we're acknowledging you have jurisdiction over your own children, but we're not going to resource this for you. So there are a lot of systems that have to change, that have to decolonize, and I think we have to, all of us, all Canadians, have to move forward on taking one system at a time and decolonizing it.
And Ms. Buller, just one final question for you here. The inquiry heard many allegations of RCMP officers sexually assaulting Indigenous women and girls. Now, one of those accounts is actually on paper as part of an RCMP complaint investigation in Prince George. What do you think should be done about it?
Well, first of all, I think the report should be made public so that everyone has access to the same information. I think that's first and foremost. And I think the next step, once it's made public, is for the RCMP to take ownership. I think it's very tragic, but very typical, that the women aren't believed until a white man says it's so. Because those women have been telling their stories for many, many years, and no one believed them. And so now that a white man has said it's been happening, people believe it. And that's so misogynistic, that's so racist, that's so sexist, when women have been saying this all along and nobody has believed them.
Well, Ms. Buller, certainly a lot to think about moving forward here as we continue, but I want to say thank you, and we certainly appreciate your time and your insight into this issue, and it's one that certainly won't be going away anytime soon, so we'll certainly be watching it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.